Welcome to the Technology, Risk and Gambling podcast, produced by the Technology Addiction team at the Brain and Mind Centre at the University of Sydney. I'm Dr. Sally Gainsbury, and I'm a professor of psychology. This season is titled Informed Decisions, Financial Behaviour in Persuasive Digital Environments. Across these conversations, I'm asking the central question of what does it actually take for people to form intentions about money and follow through on them when the digital environments they're navigating are specifically designed to influence their behaviour. This season is supported by BetWell, a tool developed by our team at the Brain and Mind Centre, which enables people to bet with more insight, intention and clarity. BetWell is an example of the type of intervention I'll be talking about this season, where we're looking at closing the gap between what people intend to do and what they actually do. You can find out more at betwell.org.au. Today I'm speaking with Carly Grace Allen, who is a senior UX designer and PhD candidate embedded in Norsk Tipping in Norway and completing her doctorate degree at NTNU Göteborg on intervention design and responsible gambling. Since 2019, Carly has been designing and testing responsible gambling tools directly within the live platform, not in a lab, but with real players making real decisions. She has published her first studies, presented at Interact 2025, which was a field experiment with over 122,000 players, testing whether the framing of a risk message changes how player responds. With this recent work, she is looking at the rollout of a mandatory limit setting tool that reached close to 500,000 players. And these results are really interesting about how we can think about what is possible at scale. So Carly, welcome and over to you. Hello, Carly. Welcome to the Technology, Risk and Gambling webinar series. It is an absolute pleasure to have you.
Thank you so much for having me, Sally. I'm glad to be here.
That sounds great. So whenever you're ready, you can start.
Awesome. So I want to talk to you a little bit about responsible gambling and my field of specialty, which is interaction design. And I want to first start off by explaining, because most people don't really know what interaction design is. And there are two ways that you can if you really want to make it as simple as possible, two ways to describe it. So you can talk about how interaction design looks at the look of something, often technology, the feel of it, so what a person feels while using it, and the usability. Or another quick and easy definition is also that something is usable, useful, and used. Because if something is useful and usable but not used, it's useless, right? If it's usable and used but not useful, then there's no point. And if it's useful and used but not usable, then it's not going to really be used very well. So the whole idea behind interaction design is that we want to improve how something can be used, is used, and how people feel about using it. And there are two other terms that are sometimes used that are similar to interaction design, and that's user experience or UX design, and also human-computer interaction, which is a lot more in the research field. One thing I want to talk about when it comes to RG and interaction design is risk communication, messages and messaging. So we often, when we think of risk communication, there's often looking at and tracking player behavior, evaluating risk for developing problems with gambling. There's often communication in the moment, so when something is actively happening. And there's often, in my experience, at least from what I've read and seen, it's often a focus on those players that show higher risk or players who play higher risk games. But that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. So one example of how I worked with risk communication is in my company in Norsk Tipping. We had a risk communication and risk analysis tool that we used for 10 years called PlayScan. And it looked like this, where there was a scale of 1 to 6, with 1 being green and low risk, 2 dark red being high risk. And you see that little notification icon in the up right-hand corner. Players got that from the tool if they had gone up on the scale from green to the yellow orange or red, or from yellow or orange to red. So the risk communication before that was built into this tool was just a small little icon. And if you're like me, you have to click on the icon to find out what's going on. But most people aren't like that. And so a lot of people don't necessarily realize that they had an increase in risk from the risk analysis tool. However, about 2 years ago, my company decided to insource and redo this whole thing. And so we went from PlayScan to Spilepuls. It's a Norwegian company, so it's a Norwegian name. And you see that there is some changes here. We kept that scale, but instead of a little notification icon, we actually decided that when a player logged in, if they had a change in their risk score, that they would have a message pop up and take over their screen on mobile, on app, or on desktop. And it was as simple as one of two message variants, because we did an A/B test. Hi, player name. So, hi, Sally. Your playing has changed. Or, hi, Sally. Yellow zone or red zone, whichever one they had moved to. You have increased risk. Go to Speed Boost to check your risk status. We wanted to see what happened here when we decided to go from an icon to a full message, a full communication, if you would like to say. And we looked at these messages and we wanted to have it not just be, we want to really look at them, not just create a little message and just say, hey, we're good to go, but actually think about how it looks, how it feels, and the wording in it. So we looked a little bit at prospect theory, how decisions are made based on biases, how we frame information. And framing theory is very much, as many know, how information is framed can impact decision making, either positive or negative, very often. So also going a little bit into self-determination, we wanted to try to maybe create a little bit of internal motivation, but also still have that autonomy. You can see that at all times, a player can close a message, click the blue button to Speed Boost. We want to give an easier opportunity to find out more about a change they didn't necessarily know they had, and find out more information and potentially do something based on that. And the results were very fun to look at. So we called the one on the left our general framing, and the one on the right negative framing. Because general is just very simple, your playing has changed. And that got more players to click on the button to Speed Boost to actually go and look at the risk profile and see what it says about their playing style, and give them the opportunity to take a self-test, to set lower limits, to take a play break, to look at their spending overview, and maybe even lock themselves out of playing future games. However, even though the general framing got more players in, the negative framing actually got statistically more people to take action. And if we actually looked at it numerically, it was almost the exact same number. So it was very interesting to see that general framing information, very basic, your playing has changed, created a lot of curiosity in players to be like, what's going on? And the negative framing got fewer people to do so, because you have increased risk. That's a little scary, but can also create some curiosity. But mentioning from the get-go, you have increased risk, showed players that, hey, maybe this is something I should do something about. And we had about 30 to 40% of players click on 34 to 40% of players click on this button compared to a traditional, if you're lucky, 10% that click on a traditional push notification. And so it was really interesting to see and compare, so that once players clicked on this blue button, they came to this page right here on the left-hand side. And we were able to actually get more people to take action to reduce their risk profile. And what's interesting about this was that this risk communication message was not purely or predominantly even to players with higher risk or higher risk who played higher risk games. 74% of them actually were in that low risk category who went from green to that first very early signs of risk. So we found that this was a great way to communicate early on with players before more risky gambling behaviors starts, or maybe come back because maybe they've taken a break and gone back down in risk, and so that we can communicate not just later after we've very easily and clearly seen risky behavior, but early on before that behavior really starts and the player starts to notice it. So there's a lot of preventative measures that you can do with risk communication messages. I also want to talk a little bit about mandatory limits. And that can sound a little scary because mandatory means you have to do it, it's required. People don't really like that. People can get a little annoyed and frustrated, but Norsk Tipping, the company I worked at, decided, you know what? We have about 68% of all of our active players who have a limit, but that means almost 32% of people don't have a spending limit because they haven't necessarily played a game that requires it. If you play just lotteries and a couple sports betting, specific sports betting games, you don't need a limit. But we decided, with the World Cup coming up, and with a little bit of dialogue with the governments, we decided everyone's just going to have a mandatory limit. And so we decided to send one of these 3 messages to 900,000 players. And they got one of 3 different messages, and they're all very similar, saying, "Hi, all customers must now set a global limit to play with us," and describing that a personal global limit helps you to keep control of your playing and not use more money than you have planned to use. And we have a little recommendation for the limits. And we have 3 different versions because there are different types of players and people play different amounts. So we had the one on the left, which was for all players who spend over 45 euros on average a month, where we show them a recommendation, what their normal spending is per month. And we decided to go with a little bit one of the higher months of the last few months, especially because there had just been Christmas, to make sure that they can still play even if they decide to play a little bit more one month than on average, but have that little normative information under. Most people play for less than 1,000 kroners, which is a bit under 100 euros or so. So those who spent over 45 euros a month on average got the one on the left. Those who spent under 45 euros a month on average got the one in the middle, where we mainly focused on that normative. Most people play for less than 1,000 kroners a month. And all new customers, so people who just created an account, had no playing history to look at, maybe they haven't played with us in several months, or they had won a lot recently, then they got the one on the right. And then that recommendation was not based on playing history, but based on age. And we had a maximum amount where we never recommended over 10,000 kroners, which is a bit under 1,000 euros. Because even though Norsk Tipping has a maximum limit of about 2,000 euros, we decided, even though there are some people who spend more than 1,000 euros, we're not going to recommend over that. We just don't think that's ethically really okay. But we still show them what their normal spending is and what average spending is. And it's been really fun to see how this has changed. This was only put in production in May, and so far over 467,000 players have received a message, and 461,000 of them have saved the limit for the first time. So some of them are trying to get around this mandatory message, but it pops up every single time that they log in, so they have not been able to play very much at all since they got it. And the majority of them are those who spend a little bit over 45 euros a month, over 200,000. A bit under 200,000 spend under 45 euros a month. And 52,000 players have received the message that have no recent spending are in positives of one lot or are brand new players. And what's interesting to see about this and really great to see is that less than 6,000 of these over 450,000 players were higher risk, players that showed higher risk. And so we see that this is a great preventative tool that once they have that limit set, the chances for them going over that limit, they have to go to the player profile and then actively choose to go over that instead of accidentally going over these limits without having one because they don't know that it exists. So now we're seeing we went from 68 to over 86% of all customers now have limits. So the other bit over 430,000 will eventually get it. But that just shows that they don't play very frequently. And so that this message will be very much on the preventative side for them as well, because they don't play very often. But it will help players, and we have seen it already, help players keep better control, especially under events like the World Cup. And when there are periods where people maybe play a little bit more, it'll help stop them a little bit before things can start going out of control or increasing without them realizing it. We've had over 40,000 comments from players in this message. About 1 in 10 have left us a comment. And those comments have been really interesting to look at because almost 34% of the comments have been positive, saying, thank you so much, great tool, have a good weekend, just players being really positive and happy. Almost 60% were very neutral, like, okay, nice, have a good day, just very much like, yeah, that's fine. And neutral is always good, right? That means they are neither, they're ambivalent to it, right? And less than 7% of players were outwardly negative about this. Some of them thought that this was very, like that we were kind of going into their personal lives, that we're not babysitters and all that. But to see that so many, almost 34% were actively positive was a big surprise for us. But I also think can be a great thing to share with others and show that just because something is mandatory, and something also such as mandatory limits, is not an inherently negative thing. Players can and in this case, as it shows, will react very positively. And I think part of the reason why we were lucky enough to see such a positive response was that in Norway, Norsk Tipping has a relatively high trust. We are a monopoly, and so I can't say that this is 100% replicable for every other gambling company out there who really does care about their players. But I think it shows the possibilities that having customers do things in a mandatory setting is not inherently negative and can actually show some positive results in the long run. So we're excited to keep following up with this and see how it goes. I also want to talk a little bit about what is found in the research literature, and not just what I've done, but what you kind of hear and see a little bit. And a lot of the research out there focuses still on physical casinos, which is fully understandable. I think somewhere around 80% of all global gambling revenue still comes from physical casinos. But in countries like Norway and in England, we are seeing that the majority, if not in Norway's case, all gambling happens online. And so I think there needs to be more research done in the online context, and that's where interaction design can really support responsible gambling research and literature. And there are some people who have talked about how much design can support responsible gambling, even if they themselves don't necessarily do that themselves. So there are multiple quotes. I think one that I liked very much was how Auer and Griffiths has talked about how the design of a feedback system for facilitating responsible gambling is paramount, and that HCI and persuasive systems design principles, PSD principles, should be at the heart of such systems. and how it's the viability of this can be great in motivation in creating guidelines for designing effective and persuasive RG tools to facilitate responsible gambling. Or how such techniques as interaction design, human-computer interaction, and UX, they offer an unprecedented opportunity to manage responsible online gambling beyond what is offered by current RG tools. There is a lot of great, there's so many tools out there, and there is a lot of great research out there. But so much of the gambling world is moving more and more online. And if we wait until more of that's online, then the interaction design aspect, the aspect that can really help try to increase the effectiveness of these tools, is going to come after. And we really want to have that come now before we see even more of the gambling move online to help create that safer arena for people moving online, because gambling is now on your phone. It's right here. I can just pull it out of my pocket and start gambling. And with physical casinos, you have to travel there, right? And so it's a little bit more condensed in an environment, but when it's on a mobile, it's in your everyday environment. And so I think that interaction design and RG can intersect in a very beautiful way to help strengthen the responsible gambling research that is already out there. And what's great about that too is that a lot of gambling companies that also do care about responsible gambling, they have designers already employed, interaction designers such as myself or UX designers. So we're already there. We're already a resource ready to be used. But if they don't know what responsible gambling is, and the responsible gambling specialists don't know who interaction designers are, then we can't make that bridge. And a great example of how this is done in industry as well is something that we call player polls. And this has been my pet project for 7 years now. And we have, it's where we've looked at different user groups and looked at their behavior and seen, okay, what kind of behavior have we seen in our customer data that is problematic? And then we create a message specifically for them. And we often start with a message that pops up. This is hi. And we try to get players to either come in to read the message or they can look at it later. And then they get a message such as one of these three, where we say, hey, is it time for a new tactic? Here's your loss in Oddsen, which is the main sports betting game. And we show them the loss last 6 months. Their average odds, but the average odds for winning in all winning bets in Oddsen, and encourage them to set a lower limit. Or maybe ask them, do you maybe play because you need money? And the majority of those who play lose money, reminding them of their loss the last month, but also the last 6 months. But it's not always focused on loss. We also have messages where we send them to players saying, congrats, you won, for example, 1,025 kroners. And then we try to use different types of framing. Did you know that those who transfer their winnings right away lose less on gambling? Choose how much you want to transfer to your bank account. Or we pre-fill out the entire amount of their winnings, but also show them how much they have in their player accounts. So they can automatically, just with one click, transfer their entire winnings so they don't play it up, or transfer more or less. And there are players that transfer more than they won. There are players who transfer less, and we do not see them transferring money back to their player account the same day to play up those winnings. So there's a lot of different ways that interaction designers and RG specialists and people who work in the commerce departments of companies, it's been an interdisciplinary team that's worked on creating these. That when you work together, there's a lot that you can do and see some really great results from it. And so I think that it's interesting and fun to show kind of the difference between interaction design and responsible gambling research, but also where our shared focus is. And we share our focus around player well-being, putting the player and the people first. creating informed choice, trying to show them clear information and transparency, designing safeguards by seamlessly integrating tools that make them easy to use, try to have evidence-informed design using research to guide and validate decisions, and also trying to create ethical and sustainable experiences. We want that long-term trust and value. And interaction design, we care about the user needs, goals, and context. We care about understanding the users, testing what works. There's a lot of user experience research methods that are the same as normal research, just done to a slightly different level. And so there's a lot of ways that we can collaborate, pretty much.
That's terrific, Carly. Thank you for that level of detail. I think it's so impressive that within Norsk Tipping, there is such a focus on safer gambling, responsible gambling, and the effort in terms of UX design and consumer focus. I think in many other betting companies, there is a lot of focus on UX design more on the betting product, and the RG efforts are often much more static and less interesting and interactive for the consumer. I have got a couple of questions. I was really interested in the results about negative framing, that there's mixed results on that. Often there is research that indicates negative or fear-based framing can be effective in motivating action. There's some research that suggests it can actually increase stigma, and we have to be really careful with how a negative message comes across. And I was really interested, particularly because you were targeting specifically people who might be going from green to yellow. You weren't focused only on people who were going from like dark orange to red. So it was quite a different target group. And maybe the wording is really important there of what does risk mean? And I think there are also some cultural differences here. I think I spoke to someone about the term safer gambling, and they said, is there more fire exits? So, you know, I think that there's different sort of implications of what people are thinking about when you say risk or safe or... But that was a really interesting that motivated action. And that's really the key, because we're not just looking at click-through on messages. That's lovely, and that makes designers feel good. It is completely irrelevant if they don't do anything about it. So What are your thoughts on that specific wording and framing, and where is that line between how can you engage and motivate people versus potentially alienating or making them feel like you're...
Yeah, so I think that, and that's always a line that we so very carefully, is wording. We actually spend a significant amount of time on what words that we're going to use. And we tend to, in especially like player polls and speed boosts, to use a little bit more neutral wording for lower risk players and a little bit harsher wording for those that we see that show higher risk. Especially those who come back again and again. We see them get the same messages again and again. But I think that you can be negative without being mean, right? So there's the balance of just saying you have increased risk is definitely negatively loaded, but it's not saying you are high risk or something like that, or it's not putting it on necessarily the customer and their personality. It's that you have an increased risk. You're showing signs of that increased risk, right? It's not saying that you're doing something bad or anything.
It's focused on the behavior, and everyone that has this behavior, we send this message, that kind of normalization.
Yeah, and I think also when you do go in, when the players do click on the button to go to the page itself, it does very much focus on the behavior. So it's not just the message, right? It's also the page that they're going to. Focus is very much not on they're doing something wrong, you're bad or whatever, but it's focusing on this is what your behavior is showing. And I think the ability to take a self-assessment on that same page, almost right underneath where you're seeing the information about your risk profile, allows a lot of players to also then see, okay, well then do I agree or disagree with this? Because there are players who are green from our risk analysis tool, but get a yellow, orange, or red score because maybe they've taken a break, or maybe that they are in an older age category and have different markers in the system, but they themselves experience it very differently. But we also have players who are shown as higher risk, but experience gambling as a lower risk because maybe they have the financial ability to play that, or maybe they are okay, maybe they aren't, and they just don't realize it yet. And so self-assessment is having that so closely linked to risk messaging, I think, is also a big plus because that was actually the tool that was used the most on the page once they went there after the risk communication message. Not setting lower limits or looking at their spending overview or taking a play break, but taking a self-assessment was the biggest one. And taking a self-assessment doesn't necessarily lead to an active tool like limits or a break, but it sets people in a much deeper context and it sets them into to the next stages of thinking, right? And have it mulling a bit and changing maybe their behavior a little bit more subconsciously than actively.
Yeah.
And that's not a bad thing.
That pre-contemplation to the contemplation stage,
exactly.
thinking about what's appropriate for me. That I really liked that finding. It's very interesting that you got into that player group specifically, and the takeaway isn't just negative messaging is good. It's much more nuanced about how to have the conversation. But I completely agree of the neutrality, non-judgmental approach is even a more appropriate word than because like you said that it's not neutral in the sense that we don't care what you're doing. It's the non-judgmental of like, we've noticed this is a risk marker, this is potentially some future action in a non-judgmental way. I'm also really impressed by those limits. That 86% of customers having limits is a very impressive outcome measure. And I'll be interested to follow up and see what happens to people retain those limits, after the World Cup, which is very recently concluded. Is that an event that will, preset, or will people change that? So I presume that's potentially something you'll look at down the road. But also the fact that you again shifting the narrative from limits being something that people are seeing because they need assistance to being a prevention tool. And again, it's universal. It's intended for the majority of players. They're not a deposit limit isn't something for someone that has high risk. A deposit limit is for every single customer, and that narrative was very clear by sending this message to everybody.
And I think one thing that was very interesting to read through the comments, and it took a long time to read through all those comments, but it was it created a lot of value because we saw on multiple occasions that one sentence about your normal spending is so much. That created a lot of interest among players saying that I didn't realize I was spending so much. Thank you for that information. And so something as simple as just that small sentence in 14-point fonts underneath the recommendation can create a lot of thoughts. And that's where the interaction design aspect comes in, is that we think about all these small things and how it can create change or subconscious or conscious thoughts. And so I think there's a lot of great stuff that responsible gaming research does, but having the interaction designer support just takes it to another level. And that was a great example of seeing that and seeing player comments on it specifically.
It's great you had that feedback loop. Now, Carly, you're in a very unique position, which is why I'm so grateful for you to come and chat with us today. I've got two questions for you. One is for operators who would like to do research such as this, what recommendation or advice do you have?
I think the first and foremost most important thing is that there has to be a culture within the operator to show that they actually care and actually mean it. That is one thing that I have seen in my 7 years in Norsk Tipping, and I've heard about in the years before that 15 years ago, it was kind of seen as responsible gambling is its own thing. It's its own people, and they don't really intrude on everyone else. But that's not how it is now, and that hasn't really been how it's been since I've been working there. It's a culture that everyone understands that this is part of our our mandate. And this is something that's important, and we're not trying to get in the way, but we're trying to support the rest of the company. And so I think that if the operator and those who work within the operator have a mutual understanding that responsible gambling is good for everyone involved, then the ability to do research in it will be that much easier, that much better, and also have much better results. Because then you're not fighting people internally, which I have seen occasionally that people don't necessarily fully understand what we do and why we do it, and maybe why we want to do one thing over the other. But it's an understanding that when you're open about it, it makes for some really great discussions and makes research really easy. And so I have coworkers who I don't work with them ever at all. We're over 400 people. And they come up to me, it's like, oh, it's so cool that you're doing research here. You have to share your results. And like, it's created an environment of excitement for research. And I love that.
That's really cool. And on the flip side, for researchers who would like industry to take up their research or to be able to influence industry practices, what do you think your colleagues are looking for? What helps the translation of academic research into industry practice?
I think there are multiple aspects to that. I think one thing I first and foremost notice is just being open access. If we can't read the research, then it can't be used. And most gambling companies aren't going to have access to a lot of gambling research because it's not open access. They'll only have access to the abstracts and maybe the conclusion and all that. And there's a lot of great research out there that is just inaccessible for those who work in industry. So I think that's a huge thing. I also think that there's a lot of great stuff out there that I sometimes wish that there could be a paragraph or two in research occasionally that just kind of simplifies it into not how researchers can continue the research, but how industry can work with this. Because there are people in industry who are interested in working on this, not just Norsk Tipping, but they don't know how to get started. And so sometimes either having that little information in an article about how industry can work with this, but also occasionally just reaching out and talking just creates a lot of opportunity. And that's why I think there's a lot of great conferences out there. The EL seminar that I'll be going to in September, or EASG, CAG, or SNSUS, like coming to some of these and just starting to get to know people who aren't just in the research fields, and also trying to encourage operators to go to these as well, and not just like the big ICE conference, which is crazy, and with 4,000 people or whatever. I think that researchers need to try to reach out a little bit, but also make their research actually accessible, because it's out there. It's just not accessible for a lot of operators and those who work in industry. I have coworkers who ask me, hey, can you download this article for me so that I can actually read it, because they don't have access. And I'm more than happy to do that because I have access to the university that I collaborate with. But I can't do that for everyone, right? All the time. And that's only because they know that I have access, right? And
that translation piece is really important. As a closing, do you have any book or report or any resource that you recommend for people who want to learn more about this issue or the idea of interaction design? Is there anything that you think is a must read?
Oh, that's a great question. I have a lot of great books that I like. One that I know that has been actually recommended on here already was Dark Patterns by Brignull. I think I actually have that. Harry Brignull, I have that right here, actually.
Very good.
Is a great one. There's also another book called Designing for Behavior Change. And it's written by a behavioral scientist who works with designers. And so it's a little bit more on the design side, but I think it can help show researchers kind of what are the possibilities of working with a designer. because design is not about making things look pretty. And that's a big misconception that I often see, is that it's just about the pretty aspect. But as I show here, it's very much about user understanding, about experience, about design, yes, but also that it's useful, usable, and used. Right? So I think that's a good example of a book to help kind of better understand what designers are trying to do and how designers can also be a bit better about that behavior aspect. Yeah.
We can certainly link to those in the show notes, and also to give a plug to those upcoming presentations that you mentioned later in the year. And then as a teaser, for the final question, where is your PhD taking you next?
So I have a lot of plans coming up, actually. I am planning on writing an article about the mandatory limits, going a little bit more in depth about that, to also see what it is they saved as limits. If they saved our recommendation or not, because in our experience, there's a lot of them that do save that or lower. But I'll also be looking at trying to do a bit of an analysis of websites at both the manipulative and the positive design aspects, because we can do things that are unconsciously manipulative or persuasive on the positive side, as well as the whole goal of my PhD is to create a set of guidelines of how responsible gambling research and interaction design can work together to create better and more effective responsible gambling tools on both the preventative side and the reactionary side. So hopefully I'll be able to reach my goal in a bit more than 2 years with those guidelines, which will help both researchers and those in industry.
Thank you so much, Carly. Your work is such an important bridge between so many different fields. It's a rigorous empirical work. It's inside an operator, and so you're getting to then see the impacts and follow up over time, which is really very rare in this field, and you're sharing it publicly. So I really take away from this conversation your point about design is not decoration, it's the substance. It's critical to influencing behavior, and it's not peripheral choices. These are the interventions, and there's so much nuance to it, but we don't have to be experts. You don't have to get everything right. Like you say, you can tweak a few things and see what happens. And there's a lot of opportunity for growth, even without doing a PhD thesis. You don't have to do a PhD to do this. But when you can look at this scale, it's hard to argue with these results and what that really means too. So we will definitely link to the papers you've already published, your upcoming presentations in the show notes. And I really encourage anyone who's further interested in this to get in touch with Carly, available via LinkedIn, and to follow the excellent work you're doing. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sally.
Thank you for listening today. You can find the Technology, Risk and Gambling podcast on Spotify, Apple Playlists, YouTube, wherever you listen. If this series is useful to you, please share it with any colleagues, and I'd love a 5-star review or a comment to ensure we can reach the people who are doing the right kind of work. This episode was recorded on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I would like to pay my respects to the past, present and emerging leader on the land that I'm on and on the lands on which you're all listening. This podcast is produced by the Technology Addiction team at the Brain and Mind Centre within the University of Sydney, and I would like to give my particular thanks for the production support from Eunice Wing and Asha Osborne. I'm Sally Gainsbury. Thanks for listening.